The metal cage was supposed to be unbreakable, a barrier between man and predator. But as the massive great white shark slammed into it with unimaginable force, the steel twisted like paper. The locks snapped, and the diver was no longer protected in seconds. The shark lunged, its jaws closing around him, dragging him into the depths. Blood filled the water. There was no escape. These are 6 real shark attack stories, each more terrifying than the last. The boat rocked gently in the waters off Gansby, South Africa, as the crew prepared for another thrilling shark dive. February 3, 2025, was supposed to be a perfect day for tourists seeking the ultimate underwater experience. The sea was calm, the visibility was clear, and excitement buzzed through the small group of divers on board. Among them was 29-year-old Tom Harrison, an experienced diver who had traveled from Australia just for this moment. Tom had always been fascinated by great white sharks. He had spent years studying them, watching documentaries, and dreaming about coming face to face with one in its natural habitat. Cage diving in Gansby, one of the world's most famous great white hotspots, was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. This wasn't his first dive, but the most important one yet. The boat, Ocean Hunter, had taken dozens of tourists out every week, lowering them into reinforced cages so they could safely observe the ocean's top predator up close. The crew worked efficiently, securing the metal cage to the side of the boat, checking the locks, and preparing the bait. Large chunks of fish meant to lure the sharks into view. The salty air mixed with the scent of blood as the crew tossed the bait into the water, waiting for a sign that the predators were near. Tom stood at the edge of the deck, adjusting his wetsuit and checking his oxygen tank. Other divers, some nervous and others eager, chatted excitedly, waiting for their turn. The first group entered the cage, gripping the metal bars as they peered into the water. The bait floated a few meters away, swaying with the current. Minutes passed, and then a shadow emerged from the deep. A massive great white shark, over 15 feet long, glided toward the cage, its black eyes locked onto the movement. The divers inside held their breath as the predator circled them, its massive body brushing against the bars. The boat's crew cheered, snapping photos and filming the encounter. The shark inspected the bait and disappeared as quickly as it had come. Tom couldn't wait any longer. He was up next. His heartbeat quickened as the crew helped him into the heavy metal cage, locking the top and securing it with thick chains. The boat captain gave the signal and the cage lowered into the water. As Tom descended, he gripped the bars and took deep, controlled breaths. The water was colder than expected, but he focused on the endless blue around him. He scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. The surface above shimmered in the sunlight, but below, the ocean was a vast unknown. Then, from the corner of his vision, he saw something. A dark shape moved swiftly, growing larger by the second. Without warning, the great white shark shot toward him like a torpedo, its powerful body cutting through the water with terrifying speed. It didn't hesitate. It rammed into the cage with full force, the impact sending a deep metallic groan through the structure. Tom stumbled backward, gripping the bars tightly. The shark's head smashed against the metal, its jaws snapping just inches from his face. The force of the attack was unlike anything the crew had ever seen. The impact twisted the metal, bending the bars outward. The divers on the boat screamed, watching in horror as the shark rammed the cage again, this time with more force. The locks groaned under the pressure, the hinges rattling violently. Tom's breath came in short gasps. He tried to steady himself, but the shark wasn't finished. It rammed the cage thrice, and the lock gave way this time. The top of the cage burst open. The boat crew scrambled, shouting orders, trying to hoist the cage, but it was too late. The shark lunged forward, its massive jaws clamping onto Tom's leg, yanking him from the cage in one brutal motion. A wave of blood exploded into the water as Tom was dragged downward. He thrashed, his hands clawing at the shark's rough skin, but the predator's grip was unbreakable. The boat's deck was chaotic, people screaming, the crew rushing to throw flotation devices, but no one could reach him in time. Tom's body jerked violently as the shark shook its head, tearing flesh from bone. Blood clouded the water, turning it into a nightmarish red haze. His limbs spasmed, his lungs burning as he struggled for air. He reached for the surface, for anything, but the shark pulled him deeper. The crew tried to fight back. A deckhand grabbed a metal pole and pounded the water, hoping to distract the predator. Another crew member fired a flare into the ocean, desperate to scare it off. But the shark was in a frenzy. With one final devastating bite, it tore through Tom's torso. The boat rocked as waves of blood surfaced, sending shock through the onlookers. The other divers, still in wetsuits, stood frozen in horror. The cage, now empty, dangled from the side of the boat, its bars twisted and broken. The ocean was eerily silent. The only sounds were the wind and the soft waves lapping against the hull. Then, the dark shape of the great white disappeared into the deep, leaving nothing behind but the red trail fading in the current. The boat crew called for emergency response, but nothing was left to recover. The ocean had taken him. The realization sank in as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the water. Tom Harrison, the man fascinated by sharks, had become their prey. The ocean hunter turned back toward shore, the mood on board heavy with shock and grief. No one spoke. No one could. The once thrilling adventure had become a nightmare that would be retold in fear for years. Back in Gansbai, authorities launched an investigation into what had gone wrong. The cage had been reinforced and built to withstand force, yet it had failed against the great white's relentless power. Experts speculated that the shark had been drawn in by heightened aggression, perhaps hunger or territorial instincts triggered by the bait. But no explanation could change what had happened. Tom's name would become part of the ocean's history, another reminder that no matter how much humans try to control their encounters with nature, the sea and its creatures remain untamed. The warm waters off Key West, Florida coast were alive with activity on November 7, 2024. Tourists filled the docks, excited to experience the beauty of the ocean from above. Boats lined the shore, taking passengers out for snorkeling, fishing, and parasailing. Among them was 24-year-old Sarah Davis, a visitor from Ohio, who had been looking forward to her first parasailing experience. Sarah had always loved the ocean, but had never seen it from 200 feet in the air. She and her friend, Jenna Cole, booked the trip with Blue Horizon Parasailing, a well-known company that had operated for years without incident. The boat was packed with other tourists, all eager to take turns soaring over the water. The captain, Mark Reynolds, and his assistant, Ben Foster, prepared the harness and parachute while explaining safety procedures. The morning had started with clear skies, a slight breeze, and perfect conditions for parasailing. Sarah felt nervous and excited as she stepped into the harness. The boat picked up speed, and within seconds, she was lifted high above the waves, her legs dangling in the open air. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, its surface calm with only the occasional ripple from passing boats. Sarah's heart raced with adrenaline. She could see everything from her height: the shoreline, the people on the beach, and even schools of fish darting below. It felt peaceful, almost surreal. She laughed, waving down at Jenna, who was snapping pictures from the boat. But beneath the surface, something else was moving. A 14-foot great white shark had been spotted by fishermen earlier that morning. Unusual for the warm waters of Key West, the predator had likely followed migrating prey closer to shore. Great whites were rare in the area, but not impossible. No one on the boat knew that the ocean's most feared hunter lurked beneath Sarah's swinging legs. As the boat made a slow turn, Sarah's parachute shifted slightly with the wind, swinging her gently to one side. She adjusted her grip on the harness, still enjoying the ride. Below, the boat continued forward, its engine humming steadily as it maintained speed. Then, without warning, the water exploded. A massive force surged from the depths, a blur of gray and white breaking through the surface. The great white shark launched into the air, its powerful jaws clamping down on the thick tow rope connecting Sarah to the boat. The impact sent vibrations through the line, jerking Sarah violently in her harness. The tourists on board screamed. The captain spun around, eyes wide in shock. The shark's teeth tore into the rope, shaking it aggressively and thrashing it as if it had mistaken it for prey. The rope stretched, the tension unbearable, and the metal clips groaned under the strain. Then, with a deafening snap, the rope broke. Sarah plummeted. She hit the water hard, the wind knocked from her lungs. Disoriented, she struggled to regain control, her parachute sinking beside her. The boat crew sprang into action, shouting orders and racing to turn the vessel around. But Sarah wasn't alone in the water. Before she could react, The shark was on her. It struck fast, seizing her leg in its massive jaws. The pain was instant, a searing, crushing pressure that shot through her body. Sarah screamed, kicking wildly, her arms thrashing. Blood filled the water, spreading in thick clouds around her. Jenna, still on the boat, watched in horror as her best friend was dragged beneath the surface. She screamed for the crew to hurry, but they were already moving, throwing flotation devices, reaching for anything to pull Sarah back. The shark twisted violently, jerking Sarah deeper. Her harness tangled around her, making it harder to move. She clawed at the straps, fighting against the weight pulling her down. The shark released its grip momentarily, circling back through the bloodied water. Sarah's head broke the surface, her arms flailing, eyes wide with terror. She gasped for air, reaching desperately for the boat. The crew was almost there. Ben leaned over the side, extending a hand toward her, but the shark wasn't finished. With terrifying speed, it lunged again, clamping down on her other leg. Sarah let out one final gut-wrenching scream before being yanked under. The water churned violently, a whirlpool of foam and blood. The boat reached the spot where she had been only seconds ago. The crew threw a rescue pole into the water, but nothing was left to grab. Jenna collapsed onto the deck, sobbing uncontrollably. Then, miraculously, Sarah surfaced again. Her face was pale, her arms weakly treading water. Her legs, one of them severed below the knee, hung motionless beneath her. Now circling a few feet away, the shark seemed to hesitate as if deciding whether to strike again. Captain Mark and Ben grabbed her, hauling her onto the boat. Blood poured from her mangled limbs, pooling onto the deck. The tourists were frozen in shock, their faces drained of color. Jenna dropped beside her, pressing her hands against the wounds, screaming for help. The captain gunned the engine, racing back toward shore. Mark shouted into the radio, calling for emergency medical response. Sarah's breathing was shallow, her body trembling violently from blood loss. Jenna held her hand, whispering her name repeatedly, begging her to stay awake. The tourists pressed towels against her wounds, but the blood wouldn't stop. Sarah's fingers curled weakly around Jenna's hand before slipping away. By the time they reached the dock, paramedics were waiting. The crew carried Sarah's limp body onto a stretcher, working frantically to resuscitate her. The sirens wailed as the ambulance doors slammed shut, but everyone on board knew the truth deep down. Sarah was gone. Jenna sat motionless, staring at the bloodstains on the boat deck, her hands still shaking. Once beautiful and peaceful, the ocean now felt entirely dangerous and unforgiving. The great white shark had disappeared, sinking back into the depths, leaving behind only a broken tow rope and the horror of what had just happened. The air was warm, the kind of summer heat that made the sand unbearable to walk on without sandals. That afternoon, the beach in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, was nearly empty, aside from a few distant beachgoers and the rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore. It was July 18th, 2023, a day that started as another quiet, sun-soaked afternoon. Mark Stevenson, 32, and his girlfriend Emily Carter, 28, had spent the last 3 days on vacation trying to escape the stress of their lives back in Boston. Emily was excited about the trip and eager to relax, swim, and enjoy the peaceful beach. Mark, however, was distant, his mood shifting between quiet frustration and sudden irritation. The day had begun well enough. They had breakfast at a small diner, walked along the coastline, and took photos together. But by midday, the mood had changed. A disagreement over something small had escalated into something worse. Tense and visibly agitated, Mark walked ahead while Emily followed, trying to talk to him. Their voices carried over the empty beach, sharp and filled with anger. The argument peaked near a secluded part of the shoreline where the water was shallow and the waves rolled in gently. Exhausted from the fight, Emily crossed her arms and shook her head. Mark, his hands clenched into fists, turned toward the water. Then, without thinking, without pausing, he shoved her. Emily stumbled back, her feet slipping on the wet sand. Before she could catch herself, she fell backward into the shallow surf. The cold shock of the water hit her instantly, and she gasped, scrambling to sit up. Mark let out a breath, his anger still burning. But something else, something far worse, was already in motion. Neither of them knew that a predator had been watching beneath the waves. A 15-foot great white shark had been circling nearby, drawn in by the movement, the splashing, the vibrations cutting through the water. It had been lurking just past the sandbar, moving cautiously at first, its instincts guiding it toward potential prey. Emily pushed herself onto her hands, her body halfway submerged in the water. She turned toward Mark, about to yell, but then she saw something behind him, something moving fast. The water exploded. A massive shadow surged upward, jaws snapping open in a blur of white and gray. The shark struck with unrelenting force, its teeth clamping down on Emily's leg before she even had time to scream. Mark's eyes widened in horror as Emily's body jerked violently. The shark thrashed, dragging her further into the water, the impact sending waves rolling toward the shore. Emily's scream was brief, cut off as she was pulled under, her arms flailing. Mark lunged forward, splashing into the water, reaching for her. He caught her wrist for a split second, his grip tight, his breath ragged. Then the shark yanked her again. Emily's body was ripped from his grasp. Blood filled the water, spreading outward in thick, dark swirls. Mark stumbled back, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The great white wasn't finished. It dove, pulling Emily deeper, twisting its powerful body as it tore through flesh and bone. Mark waded further in, his chest heaving, his heart pounding in his ears. He couldn't see her. The water was shifting, the waves moving in and out, but Emily was gone. Then, just as suddenly as she had disappeared, she surfaced again. Her face was pale, her mouth open in a silent cry. One of her arms reached toward the shore, but her body was limp, her other arm nearly severed. The water around her churned with blood. Mark rushed forward, but the shark struck again before he could get close. Its massive jaws closed around her midsection, pulling her under in a violent surge. Mark last saw Emily's terrified, wide eyes before the ocean swallowed her whole. Silence followed. The water settled, the waves returning to their natural rhythm, erasing any sign of the horror that had just unfolded. Mark stood there, chest deep in the water, staring at the space where Emily had been. His legs shook, his hands trembled. Then reality crashed in. He turned and ran, stumbling back onto the shore, his breath ragged, his mind screaming. His voice broke as he called for help, but no one was close enough to hear. A lone lifeguard on duty had seen something in the distance, waves splashing too violently, something unnatural about the movement near the secluded shore. When Mark's cries reached him, he grabbed his radio and called for emergency response. Minutes later, the beach was flooded with first responders. Boats were deployed and helicopters hovered overhead. But it was too late. There was no sign of Emily. The search lasted hours, but hope faded as the sun began to set. The rescue teams found only torn pieces of clothing drifting in the water, strands of long, dark hair caught in the foam, and one blood-stained sandal washed up on the shore. Mark sat on the sand, his hands buried in his hair, his body still shaking. The lifeguards tried to ask him questions, but his voice had left him. His mind replayed the moment repeatedly, Emily reaching for him, her body slipping away, the shark's massive form disappearing into the deep. Once a place of beauty and calm, the ocean held something far more sinister. The search teams packed up their equipment as darkness fell over Cape Cod. The coastline returned to silence, but for those who had witnessed the attack, that silence would never feel the same again. Cape Cod, Massachusetts is known for its picturesque coastline, with stretches of beach that draw thousands of visitors every summer. On June 11, 2023, the sun was just beginning to rise over the ocean, casting an orange glow on the water. Early in the morning, the beach was quiet, with only a few people setting up umbrellas and blankets for the day ahead. This part of Cape Cod was popular among locals for its calm waters, and it was here that triathletes from across the country would often come to train. Among the swimmers entering the water that morning was Mark Stevens, a 38-year-old triathlete from California. He had arrived in Cape Cod a week earlier, taking time off from his job as a mechanical engineer to focus on training for an upcoming Ironman competition. Mark was no stranger to challenging environments. He loved the feeling of pushing his body to its limits and had completed several Ironman races over the past decade. This race was set to be his biggest yet, and he had been putting in the hours to ensure he was ready. Cape Cod is known for its shark activity, especially in recent years. The number of great white sharks has increased due to the rising seal population along the coastline. Seals are the primary food source for great whites, and as the seals moved closer to shore, the sharks followed. Great white sharks can grow to over 20 feet long and are capable of powerful, fast attacks. They used their strong jaws to grab prey in a single strike. The day had started like any other for Mark. He ate a light breakfast, stretched, and headed to the beach to meet a few fellow athletes he'd been training with all week. They chatted about the upcoming race, joking about who would finish first, and then waded into the water. The plan was to swim a few miles along the shore, keeping a steady pace. The water was chilly, but Mark welcomed the cold. It kept him alert and focused. The swimmers spread out, each finding their rhythm. Mark settled into a strong, steady stroke, his arms cutting through the water precisely. He moved effortlessly, the result of years of practice and dedication. Every breath was measured, every kick purposeful. He focused on the race ahead as he swam, visualizing the transitions from the swim to the bike, then the run. Everything felt right. But beneath the surface, a shadow was moving closer. Cape Cod's waters, while generally safe, have become an area of concern for swimmers because of the increasing presence of sharks. Over the past few summers, sightings had become more frequent, and signs warning about sharks dotted the beach. Most people knew the risk was low, but the idea of encountering one of the ocean's top predators was always in the back of their minds. Mark had been swimming for over an hour when something brushed against his leg. It was a fleeting touch, almost like seaweed, but the sensation was enough to make him pause. He trod water, scanning the surface around him, but saw nothing unusual. He took a deep breath, dismissing the feeling as nerves, and resumed swimming. Other swimmers continued their laps a few yards away, unaware anything was wrong. Then, without warning, the water around Mark erupted. A massive, great white shark, 16 feet long, surged up from below, striking with incredible speed. The shark's jaws clamped down on Mark's arm, dragging him backward. The attack was violent, the force enough to pull Mark under the water before he even had a chance to scream. Panic took over, his limbs thrashing as he struggled to escape the shark's grip. The shark relentlessly shook its head and pulled Mark deeper into the water. Blood clouded the ocean, spreading rapidly as Mark fought with every ounce of strength. Adrenaline surged through him, striking the shark's side, and he kicked hard. The shark released him briefly, and Mark broke the surface, gasping for air. Nearby swimmers heard the commotion. They turned to see Mark's frantic movements, the splashing, the dark red spreading in the water. Shouts filled the air as they realized what was happening. A few began swimming toward Mark, desperate to help. But the shark wasn't finished. The shark attacked again as Mark tried to swim back toward the shore. This time it clamped onto his leg, pulling him under with brutal force. The pain was searing, unlike anything Mark had ever felt. His lungs burned as he struggled for air, his vision blurring from the salt water and the blood loss. Every muscle in his body screamed in agony, but he fought, kicking and striking at the predator. The other swimmers reached the scene, but the water was chaotic, filled with foam and blood. They called out, but Mark slipped further under, the shark dragging him deeper with each violent thrash. The sight was horrifying. An enormous shadow circling beneath the waves, a glimpse of a fin breaking the surface, and nothing. Lifeguards and beachgoers on shore saw the struggle and sprang into action. Emergency calls were made, boats launched, and helicopters hovered overhead, scanning the area for any sign of Mark. The minutes dragged on, and the rescue teams arrived as quickly as possible, but hope was fading fast. The water was empty and calm once more, but the blood in the waves told the story of what had happened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the search boats spotted a body floating face down 100 yards from the initial attack site. They pulled Mark from the water, his body limp, his skin pale. It was clear that the injuries were too severe. He had lost too much blood, and the bite marks left by the shark were devastating. The beach fell silent as the news spread. People enjoying a peaceful day at the shore now stood in shock, staring at the water, the reality of what had happened sinking in. Mark Stevens, a dedicated athlete and a man who had trained tirelessly for the Ironman, had lost his life in the most sudden, brutal way imaginable. The shark was never seen again. It vanished into the depths, leaving only questions and a profound loss. The swimmers who had tried to save Mark would later speak about their helplessness and the terror of seeing a friend taken by something so powerful and unstoppable. In the aftermath, Cape Cod officials increased safety measures, placing more warning signs and deploying shark spotters to monitor the waters. But for those who witnessed the attack, the memory would not fade. The beach, once a place of relaxation and joy, now felt different. A place marked by the violence of nature, where life had been taken so suddenly. Mark's death sent shockwaves through the triathlon community, a reminder of the risks that come with the sport they loved. The waters off Byron Bay, Australia, are known for their beauty and rich marine life. Every year, snorkelers and divers visit the area, eager to explore its reefs and vibrant underwater world. But beneath the surface, predators move silently, watching, waiting. On December 12, 2023, Kate Thompson, a 28-year-old travel blogger from Melbourne, learned how quickly paradise could turn into a nightmare. The morning had started like any other on the bay. The sun was warm, the waves calm, and the water clear. Kate had arrived early with a small group of tourists, eager to document another adventure for her growing online audience. She had spent years traveling, chasing new experiences, and sharing them with thousands of followers. Snorkeling in Byron Bay was just another stop on her journey, another memory to capture. She joined a tour group led by an experienced guide, Daniel Carter, who had worked these waters for over a decade. He knew the best spots where the fish gathered, sea turtles glided peacefully, and the reef came alive with color. He also knew the risks. Byron Bay was a known habitat for bull sharks. Though attacks were rare, they were never impossible. Kate and the others listened to the safety briefing, nodding as Daniel explained the importance of staying together. He reminded them to avoid sudden movements and to remain calm if they saw a shark. Most people never encountered one, but it was always a possibility. Kate didn't think much of it. She had snorkeled in different parts of the world and always felt safe in the water. The group entered the ocean, their fins slicing through the surface as they swam toward the reef. The water was warm, and visibility was perfect. Kate marveled at a sea turtle drifting lazily nearby, its shell reflecting the sunlight from above. Schools of fish darted past her, flashing silver and blue. She felt weightless and at peace. She kicked her fins gently, gliding further out, her camera in hand, capturing everything. Then something changed. The fish that had been swimming freely a moment ago scattered instantly. The water, once filled with movement, grew eerily still. A faint ripple moved in the distance, deeper than the reef, a shadow passing along the ocean floor. Kate felt a sudden unease but brushed it off. The guide said sharks lived in these waters but usually kept their distance. She continued forward, focusing on her camera when she felt it, a violent, unexpected tug on her leg. At first it didn't register. It was too sudden, too unnatural. Then a crushing force clamped onto her calf, and the water around her exploded. Kate barely had time to process what was happening before she was yanked downward. The pain shot through her body, raw and unbearable. A 12-foot bull shark had struck with terrifying speed, its powerful body slamming into her. It shook her violently, dragging her away from the group's safety. The water turned red, her blood clouding around her, mixing with the shifting currents. She tried to scream, but salt water filled her mouth as she was pulled deeper. Every survival instinct in her body fired at once. She twisted, kicking as hard as possible, but the shark's grip was unrelenting. Its teeth tore into her flesh, crushing bone, the raw agony sending shockwaves through her body. The other snorkelers had noticed the disturbance above. Daniel turned just in time to see the thrashing movement beneath the surface, the unmistakable sight of a shark attack. He shouted to the others, ordering them back toward the boat. One screamed as a streak of red rose from below, coloring the water in a growing cloud. Kate's vision blurred as she struggled to hold her breath. She reached unquestioningly for anything, something, anything to fight back. Her hands brushed against a spear one of the guides had left attached to her vest. She grabbed it with trembling fingers, forcing herself to focus despite the unbearable pain. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she drove the spear into the shark's snout. The shark recoiled, releasing its grip for a split second. That was all Kate needed. She kicked hard, ignoring the burning in her leg, her muscles screaming in protest as she fought to reach the surface. Blood poured from her wound, leaving a dark trail behind her, a beacon for the predator circling below. Daniel was already in motion, diving toward her with the urgency of someone who knew seconds meant the difference between life and death. The shark wasn't finished. It turned, ready to strike again, its cold black eyes locked on its injured prey. Kate felt herself slipping, the blood loss making her limbs weaker with each stroke. The shadow loomed beneath her again, rising, preparing for another attack. Daniel reached her first, grabbing onto her vest and yanking her upward. Another guide was already extending a hand from the boat, pulling her toward safety. The water churned violently behind them as the shark surged upward, its jaws snapping inches from where Kate had been only moments before. The crew hauled her aboard, her body limp, her leg torn open, deep gashes exposing muscle and bone. Blood poured onto the deck, the reality of her wounds setting in. Her breathing was ragged, her skin pale, her lips trembling as shock took hold. One of the passengers pressed a towel to her leg, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. The captain shouted into the radio, calling for an emergency evacuation. Kate barely heard any of it. The world around her faded in and out, her mind struggling to stay awake. She knew she was alive, but the pain was unbearable. She glanced down at her leg and nearly passed out. The shark had nearly severed it, its jagged bite leaving behind shredded skin and exposed tendons. Her body shook uncontrollably. She had survived the attack, but the damage was devastating. The boat sped toward the shore, the waves rough against the hull. The snorkelers sat in stunned silence, many unable to look at the pool of blood that had gathered on the deck. By the time they reached land, paramedics were waiting. They lifted Kate onto a stretcher, their faces grim as they assessed the extent of her injuries. The last thing she remembered before slipping into unconsciousness was the blaring of the sirens and the concerned voices around her. She had survived, but the encounter had changed her forever. As for the bull shark, it disappeared back into the depths, its hunger unsatisfied, its presence a reminder of the ocean's unpredictable danger. The water closed over the scene of the attack, washing away the evidence, but those who had witnessed it would never forget. The Maldives had always been Laura Reynolds' dream destination. The crystal-clear waters, the endless coral reefs, and the promise of an unforgettable snorkeling experience had drawn her to this paradise. She had arrived just a few days earlier, eager to explore the beauty beneath the surface. On July 8, 2024, she joined a group of tourists on a guided snorkeling trip near Mafushi Island, a well-known spot for marine life encounters. The day had started perfectly: bright skies, warm water, and the excitement of spotting exotic fish and sea turtles. Laura, 35, from Seattle, Washington, had always been an adventurous traveler. She had snorkeled before, but had never seen the Maldives' marine life up close. The guide, Ravi Patel, a seasoned local with years of experience, explained the safety rules to the group. Everyone nodded, eager to get into the water. The group was instructed to stay close to the boat, where the water was shallow and visibility was high. The first 30 minutes were mesmerizing. Schools of colorful fish darted past, and Laura swam alongside a sea turtle, filming everything on her waterproof camera. She was completely lost in the beauty of the ocean, floating effortlessly, letting the currents carry her further. The other tourists stayed close together, but Laura drifted further out, confident in her swimming skills. She didn't realize how far she had gone. The coral reef dropped off into deeper, darker waters. The playful darting fish disappeared, replaced by an eerie stillness. Below her, the ocean floor faded into a vast, open blue. She wasn't alone. A 10-foot tiger shark, drawn by the snorkeler's movements, watched from the depths. It had been circling the area undetected for a while, blending into the deeper water. Unlike reef sharks, tiger sharks were apex predators known for their unpredictable behavior. They rarely attacked humans, but when they did, the results were devastating. Laura felt a sudden shift in the water, a presence, a shadow moving beneath her. A massive shape emerged from the darkness, heading straight for her. Before she could react, the shark struck with terrifying speed, its powerful jaws clamping onto her midsection. The force of the attack knocked the snorkel from her mouth, and her scream was lost in the water. The tourists near the boat heard the muffled thrashing and turned. Panic spread instantly. Ravi, the guide, saw the horrifying sight. Laura's body half submerged, the shark's dark shape thrashing violently beneath her. He shouted for the group to stay together, grabbed a life ring, and dove in. Laura fought desperately, but the shark's teeth tore deep into her flesh. She kicked and struggled, her hands flailing as the water around her turned red. The shark dragged her downward, twisting violently, its instincts fully engaged. Ravi swam as fast as he could, reaching for her, but the shark struck again before he could pull her back. Its jaws closed around her lower body, shaking her like a rag doll. The tourists on the boat screamed as they saw Laura disappear beneath the waves. For a moment, there was only the churning, bloodied water. Then, Laura's lifeless body floated back up, torn apart, unmoving. Ravi grabbed her, struggling to pull her back toward the boat, but the shark wasn't finished. It circled back, drawn by the scent of blood. The boat captain, Neha Singh, threw a long pole into the water, slamming it against the surface and trying to drive the predator away. Out of breath, Ravi pushed Laura toward the boat, his muscles burning with exhaustion. The shark turned and swam beneath them, its dorsal fin cutting through the surface. With the help of 2 other crew members, Ravi heaved Laura's limp body onto the boat. The damage was horrifying. Her stomach and legs were torn apart, her wetsuit shredded. Blood poured across the deck, staining the white surface. The captain called for emergency medical assistance, but everyone knew it was too late. Laura wasn't moving. Her eyes were open but empty, her skin already losing its color. The tourists stood stunned, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Once a paradise, the ocean now felt like a place of terror. The boat sped back to shore, where resort staff and medics waited. The attack was unlike anything the area had seen in years. Laura's trip had started as a dream, but the ocean had claimed her before she could return home. The shark vanished into the deep, leaving nothing but horror.